Father, the Son, Holy Ghost. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. Amen. Brethren in Christ, Laudetur Jesus Christus.
In eternum.
In eternum. Amen.
How you doing, brothers? This is Timothy as Flanders, Meaning of Catholic. I'm joined by Meaning of Catholic contributors, Kennedy Hall and Jeremiah Bannister. How y'all doing?
Good, sir.
Excellent, excellent. Today we are going to talk about Catholic social teaching. What is it? We are going to be attacking politics, as this is a big election year for Americans, with President Trump up for re-election, has just been acquitted of his impeachment. And we also have in our midst a token Canadian to represent the entire Canadian populace. Thank you, Kennedy Hall.
All right.
And we're going to have more guests in the future. We have I have talked to Deacon Nick Donnelly, who has agreed to be here on the show from the UK, and hopefully others. If you're interested in talking about Catholic politics in your country, please contact me. So we're going to try to figure out what is Catholic social teaching, because there is a lot of talk from leftist Catholics who talk about Catholic social teaching. It's kind of a big buzzword for them. And there is, in fact, such a thing as Catholic social teaching. So what we're going to do here is we're going to try to nail down in this show what are the 5 non-negotiable Catholic principles of Catholic social teaching. The basic elemental principles that everybody's got to believe to be a Catholic. You got to believe in these things. And then we're going to have future shows that try to delve further into particular countries, particular political issues, more gray areas, more things that maybe we can dispute and disagree about. So I want to start with a few basics, and I want to first of all draw a distinction between, because we're going to try to figure out what Catholic social teaching is. And on the one hand, Catholic social teaching is just what the church has done in society forever, since the beginning. And on the other hand, there's also Catholic social teaching, meaning what the church has done since 1891, which was the publication of Rerum Novarum by Leo XIII, who was responding to the new things. That's what that encyclical, those words in Latin mean, Rerum Novarum, the new things, which were the Industrial Revolution, secular republics popping up and revolutions and all sorts of things, vast poverty in urban centers and things of that nature. So that's also Catholic social teaching in sort of the modern sense, meaning the modern epoch, not modernist. But so that's going to be a big distinction here, because my 5 are going to be a lot more on the former in terms of what the church has always done. And I have a feeling that one of y'all two, or maybe both, are going to talk a little bit more about some of the newer teachings. And so I'm going to start it off, and because I think the first one is not going to be, there's not going to be any disagreement between us, because my first principle is globalism. There is one kingdom overall. Christ is king and Mary is queen. First principle.
It's like social reign of Christ King kind of thing.
Yeah, there's one kingdom ruling over all. That's the first principle. Christ is king. Monarchy. What say you?
Yeah. It seems legitimate. I mean, if you don't believe that that's the case, then it kind of transforms Catholic social teaching into, well, here's just a simple suggestion from our side of the playground.
Right.
It's like, and it turns into this relativism, whereas the church's magisterial teaching on this is that it's authoritative, that it is in fact speaking about morals, because it's speaking about who people are, how we ought to, keyword ought, how we ought to behave for the reasons why we ought to do them, human interaction, valuation. What's important? What's our ultimate end and our ultimate aim? And how do all these things work together? How are they interconnected? And so the church is the only mechanism that the great Lord has given on this planet in order to teach these things with any kind of competency, jurisdiction, and authority.
Yeah.
Right.
So wait, do we all agree on number one? That's
Yeah,
the number one. Is that the most important? Is that the most important principle?
Yeah, and I'll add to that as well. Pius XI in Quadragesimo Anno, so 40 years after Rerum Novarum, he responded to this idea that people said, hey, what's the church doing in political affairs, right? What's the church doing in economic affairs, etc.? And he said, quoting here, and he said, our weighty office is the right of propagating, interpreting, and urging in season and out of season the entire moral law, demand that both social and economic questions be brought within our supreme jurisdiction insofar as they refer to moral issues. Now, moral issues, I mean, I don't know how you have an economic transaction without some sort of moral issue. I mean, even in the smallest sense of the word, it's going to be a matter of justice insofar as what's the thing worth, what's the transaction between us, what's the good, all those. So they could leave a lot alone and just sort of leave it up to the common sense of the people, I guess. But the church does have a right declared by the church herself. And it goes to the kingship of Christ that they do have the right to talk on these things with authority. And that's just kind of basic.
Yeah. So that goes to my second principle, which is the church and the state. Because as you guys are both talking, kind of implying here, is that the church speaks for God. The church speaks for Christ the King. The church is the representative of Christ the King in the world. And so between church and state, there is a distinction without a separation. Each has their sphere of competency. The church has faith and morals affect everything. Like you just said, there's really not really much that we can, maybe we can debate about the mineral composition of, these rocks. Maybe that doesn't have to do with morals per se, but then the church has faith and morals, which affect everything. And then the state has the rest to work out, and all are bound to the true king. So the church does have the competency to rule, make authoritative judgments on morals, which affect pretty much everything in political, social life. And then the king, however, the king has the competency to work some of that stuff out, which are not, I guess this is my number three, is that there is that sphere of competency where the king or the government has the authority to put into practice certain political principles that are not very simple. Not very clear-cut intrinsic evils, that type of thing. Like what kind of tax system are you going to use? That type of thing, where there's a lot of gray area, where there's a lot of disagreement about how to actually go about that. The king or the government has the competency then to kind of put that into practice. Those are my 2 and 3.
I think it's one of the reasons why the popes have said that Catholic social teaching is not a third way, because it's the idea of a third way kind of says, well, it's condemned this extreme and this extreme, and therefore everything in between is a third way. And you're like, that's a lot. There's a whole bunch at play there in between, where you can have reasonable debates over what kind of tax policy, or to what degree should government be involved in policy X, Y, or Z. And so because of that, and you would not be running afoul, right? You would not be heading like the Titanic toward the rocks of shipwreck, right? Of this kind of individualism on the one hand, this rabid, individualistic, licentious, libertine, like per example, right? And on the other side, this kind of collectivism, communism, Marxism, and in the way that plays out on both sides, they've been condemned as rocks of shipwreck. These are your extremes. But there's a whole bunch in between that, right? And so that's why you kind of see Catholics run the gamut. That's why you see this wide array of Catholic people with all different kinds of beliefs on these issues and why they're not just outright condemned, even though we happen to disagree.
100%.
Yeah.
Yep, you're right.
Yeah,
I think that's
go ahead.
Sorry, go on. Well, I was going to say, I think like we'll probably get into distributism a little bit throughout this show, I would imagine, or something like that. And I'm very much a fan of Chesterton and Belloc and their ideas. No secret there. But I've realized, I'll listen to very strong conservative American Catholic commentators, and then when they talk about distributism and things like that, which don't seem like super, I don't know, they don't seem right wing enough, if that makes sense. They get kind of nervous, and I understand why. But then I go, you know what? A lot of that has to do with a cultural lens. Like, for example, as a Canadian, like, I'm a conservative, at least morally, socially, for everything. But I'm also like a big fan of the monarchy, because just from my Canadianness, she's on our money still, the Queen's on our money and things. It's kind of part of our culture. So in Canada, if you're a conservative, you're usually a fan of the traditions of the monarchy. Whereas in America, generally speaking, if you're a conservative, you're probably not a fan of the monarchy because of the whole revolutionary history and things like that. But those are like, whatever the quote is from Augustine, on essential things, unity, on non-essential things, diversity, or however he says it, and then on all things charity. Like, there are places where prudential and reasonable minds can differ because the application will be contextual and to the culture.
Yeah, so we're going to try to nail down what some of those essentials are. And
right.
I guess, so like my 1, 2, 3 those are all essential principles of governance, society. Do you guys have any of your principles that outrank any of those?
Not as
outrank. Anything bigger? Okay. So, well, and my number 4 is the first time where we kind of get into concrete application. And my number 4 is that the family is the irreducible unit of society, meaning that everything, basically the modern, now we're going to introduce some of these terms. So when we talk about liberalism, what we're talking about is the modern secular republic state. And this is all confusing because the other thing is that republic, that term is also, the traditional sense of that term is basically a representative government, like a democracy, basically. And so like a democracy. So liberalism, when we talk liberalism, we're kind of talking like a democracy, basically. That's the modern, most states follow this liberalism in that sense. And so when we talk about liberalism, there's then, like in American politics, there's the Democrats and the Republicans. They're both under this liberalism, okay? So when I say that the family is the basic unity of society, that's against the modern liberalism, which says that the individual is the basic unit of society. Every individual has a vote. All the society, every social, the contracts, the economic system is all just based on the individual and his choice. That's just the whole system. Whereas in Catholic social thought, the irreducible system is the family, meaning the father, the mother, the children. It's all revolves around the family because the family is that basic social unit. That's my number 4. What do you think?
What do you think, Jeremy?
I'm a little bit divided. I would say that the dignity of persons, because the dignity of an individual predated, at least insofar as humankind was concerned, the family. And not only that, but I'm wondering, I'm hoping I have this quote correct on this, but it says, John the 23rd talking about Catholic social teaching, that it's based on this principle that the individual human beings are the foundation, the cause, and the very end of every social institution. And he says that is necessarily so, for men are by nature social beings. And so if we start with society, we're kind of focusing on the forest and missing the trees on that. And if we say that individuals have dignity, then individuals in an association, for one, it's where you would get rights and stuff and responsibilities on an individual basis that would allow for association. And again, going back to creation, saying Adam was created It was found not to be good that he was alone, but his dignity was still there as an individual. And at the end, and so Eve was made for him and the family, of course. But the aim, the ultimate end, isn't just for your family and the world, but ultimately that you will stand before the judgment throne of God.
Yeah, and I would say, because I have on my list, I called it respect for the human person was my second principle or whatever. And the Adam example is good because Adam was created as a singular human person, but also inherent in his creation is that he is made for relationship. So if it's almost like a 1 and a 1A. It's not, you know what I mean? Like
Right.
the person is created, but they're created. It's like the universal destination of goods that we'll probably talk about with currencies and resources. They exist on their own, but they exist for a certain purpose. So the person is created and the person has sovereign individual dignity and respect in the eyes of God. However, what that person is created for is the reason the person exists, kind of thing. So they're both very closely linked, I think.
Yeah, it sounds like it's difficult to really separate the individual from
Family.
the communion of persons. I think it's the community of persons, John Paul II, that's his phrase. Yeah. I think I remember in Thomas, he says, human nature is created in man and woman. And so man and woman do not bear the fullness of human nature by themselves in one sense, at least. But then again, like you're saying, there is, I mean, even if a man does not have a family and he's just all alone, he still has his dignity. It's not that the family gives him the dignity. The dignity is there already. So how can we define what is dignity? What is that?
I don't know, because that word's thrown around a lot today. And
Yeah. Well,
it's
I think. Go ahead. I'm sorry for interrupting you.
No, you go ahead. I was just pontificating.
Yeah. I think it comes back down to who and what is man, right? Not just what is man for, but more fundamentally, who is man? What is man? And I think John Paul II, Centesimus Annus, talking about human persons are willed by God. They are imprinted with God's image. Their dignity does not come from the work they do, but from the persons they are. And so the dignity of man would be connected intimately, right, with the fact that they are created in God's image and for a specific purpose that's related to that image and design.
Yeah,
right. And I would say it's like when people will say, and when you meet somebody, what's the first thing you ask? Usually ask you, what do you do, right? Mm-hmm. And I've heard people say, well, we treat each other as if we're human doings rather than human beings, you know. And obviously, it's a conversation starter, and it's small talk. But and you say what the person is. You say, Jeremiah, you said what the person is created for. Mm-hmm. I would also add, who is the person created for, right? Mm-hmm. We don't come from God in a pantheistic sense, but we do come from the mind of God in a creative sense. So we're created by Him, and hopefully, in the end, in His will initially for Him, but hopefully we follow that. So not only what we're created for, but who we're created for. So that even says, if you're sort of an individual man and you don't have a family, etc., you're still in relationship with the Father, with the holiest, like with the family of heaven, etc., and you're still linked to the communion of saints, etc., and the church militant and things. So you're never really alone, and you're always created in some way for something supernatural and beyond yourself.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would in the Thomistic language, I think I would be thinking of dignity has certain rights, and rights are the object of justice. The virtue of justice is what fulfills rights. So if someone has a right, the virtue of justice does that right for him. Justice, the virtue of justice is giving to each one what is owed to him or her. So obviously the virtue of justice towards God is giving to God what is owed to him. And that's like what we were talking about, very first principle, giving to God what is owed, and then giving to man what is owed to him by his dignity. His dignity is that he has certain rights which are the object of the virtue of justice. And now this is where the modern liberal state, again, in the classical sense of the term, basically they have rights, but they have no duties, because
Yes.
their system is just the sole individual, and they don't, I mean, they have the individual, which is good, like we're saying here, that's good, but they don't have the family or the community, rather. So the sense of justice is just justice from on high, going straight to the individual and back up again, sort of. It's like just only the individual, whereas the Catholic justice is going to be talking about rights and duties, because that man also has a duty to give justice to his neighbor,
Right.
because his neighbor also has dignity, and he must give that justice. But the modern liberal state is just based on let's not harm, as long as you don't harm somebody, you can do whatever you want to, type of ethic.
Well, do you guys know what our Canadian, it's like our Bill of Rights, you know what it's called?
No.
So we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's been a disaster. And it was instituted by King Trudeau the First. Now we have his son. And don't get me started. Anyway, so but it's called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which, if you that sounds all well and good, but a right and a freedom are different things. And a freedom doesn't, it's really more of a charter of certain inalienable rights. Yes, like there's some good things in there, kind of like, I don't know, everyone is what's the word, equal before the law, like that kind of stuff. It's got those inalienable sort of things there, which are just common sense. But it's turned into this, it's been used because you have freedom of religion, but you also have freedom of expression, and you also have freedom of conscience, and you have all these freedoms, but obviously at a certain point, these things come into conflict. So now we have this thing called the Canadian Human Rights Commission, which Jordan Peterson was fighting against, right, when he was under his whole thing a couple of years ago. And he was basically saying, listen, if you are a Catholic, like, you have certain things that you have to believe in order to be Catholic. And if you're tested on those things publicly, you have to, like, if you have any integrity, no matter what you believe, you have to say that you believe that thing. But the problem is that with some of the various issues, you all know what they are, that come up, it's like, well, your religious belief is in conflict with this also now enshrined identity or something like that. And both of them have freedoms, but clearly that just doesn't work, right? So the concept of having freedoms and rights without having responsibilities is a recipe for unmitigated disaster in the moral sphere.
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing right now is the globalist push for an overarching world religion, and it's basically the Christendom and the church. Like I said, we're globalists because we believe in Christ, the King of the universe. He's the king of everything, and we want to spread his dominion everywhere. And so we're globalists in that sense. We want one world religion. We want everyone to convert to Catholicism. But they're just trying to do the same thing. So they mocked us because we were trying to do that, and then they tried to create this system, but it was really just a facade to create their own one world religion. So that's what we're seeing today, with just the imposition of all these just insane policies to just subject reality to one individual person's subjective dreams or imaginings or fantasies. Kennedy, I wanted to ask you, what is your number one then?
Well, so I was looking at this more in like a practical, I believe in the kingship of Christ. So I was looking more at, okay, you're trying to apply Catholic principles to an actual place, right? Trying to make an actual functioning society based on Catholic principles. That's right. So my first one was the principle of subsidiarity. I had that as my fundamental principle. And the reason is I was looking at it sort of like the cardinal virtues, where prudence is kind of like the driving force for how the rest of the virtues have to be used. And without prudence, you can't really be just, that sort of thing. Because I thought all encompassed in the principle of subsidiarity is bringing things down to the most reasonable, common sense, and most often smallest level, which includes the family, which includes the individual. And then I was thinking more in economic terms and things like that for that reason. Also, the principle of subsidiarity is opposed to all forms of collectivism, which I find extremely dangerous, the collectivism forms. It sets limits for state intervention, and it aims at harmonizing the relationships between the individual and the society. And that's from the Catechism, actually. And that's what I had as subsidiarity was my first one.
Okay, great.
Jeremiah?
I want to, Jeremiah, I want to ask you about that. I just wanted to read the quote from Pius the 11th that sort of sums up what subsidiarity is. But I was trying to find it, and I'm not finding it right now.
A community of a higher order should not interfere in the internal life of a community of a lower order, depriving the latter of its functions, but rather should support it in case of need and help to coordinate its activity with the activities of the rest of society, always with a view of the common good. That was, yeah.
Perfect. And I got another one that's a little shorter than that. So the Quadragesimo Anno, paragraph 79, it is an injustice and at the same time a grave evil and disturbance of right order to assign to a greater and higher association what lesser and subordinate organizations can do. So that's basically sums up the basic principle. Jeremiah, where do you rank subsidiarity and how do you understand it?
I would say that I rank subsidiarity a little bit differently. And I guess I got to explain the way that I approach this. That's why I was kind of looking over here. I wasn't meaning to not pay attention or be distracted. I was kind of sitting there trying to find where I ordered subsidiarity, because what I did is I went through and said, okay, here are the primary pillars, right, of Catholic social teaching. You've got your dignity of persons, right and responsibilities, call to family and communion and participation, solidarity, creation, dignity of labor. So you can go online and you can see lists of these. And I was trying to figure out where I would place all of those if I were to have to put them in an order. And I was trying to think from whence they flowed, right? From dignity, I had rights and responsibilities, to call to family, and the most intimate non-individual association, to then solidarity being a bigger one, to then creation being the furthest out you can get. Because I believe that within each of these, you could find a great overlap. And so subsidiarity for me fleshes itself out in a couple different ways. One of them, as I was going through, I said right here, with subsidiarity, I have it under call to family, community, and participation. Okay. So I would have it ranked number 3, because dignity of persons, I would not have had rely upon that. Rights and responsibilities, it could be placed there. In fact, it probably should. But I figured rights and responsibilities in the order that I had it was kind of a Genesis account in my mind. Adam, and then he has, go and name these animals. You have a responsibility. You've got things you have to do. And then after that comes family. And through that, the broader extension of the political economy, the house taking care of household affairs. And in that construct would be subsidiarity. I can't imagine disagreeing very much on this with Kennedy or you, but I had written something years ago at the Distributist Review, and it was entitled, Will the Real Subsidiarity Please Stand Up? And people can actually still go. And I watched a video where I heard you used to be into rap, so I know, Kennedy, that you know where that came from. Will the real subsidiarity please stand up? But the thing is to me, I looked at it as a spherical thing, and that there were some matters that were without a doubt within the state's sphere of jurisdiction, and that if someone took too rigorously to the position that if it can be done, then it should be done by a lower group. That could land one in the world of Ayn Rand.
Yes.
And say, yeah. And so that my concern for that, because I know some libertarian folks where that's the position, they just say, well, if a smaller entity can do it, keep the state out. And I say that's number one. The Catholic Church too many times has said that the state's okay to be involved to one degree or another, right? To one degree or another, not to annihilate it and not to completely absorb it, but to be working together. But just to make really clear, the Ayn Rand took a position, you know, that might be like, well.
And can you explain for the viewers, Jeremiah, who is Ayn Rand?
Ayn Rand. Yeah.
What's her philosophy?
Yeah, objectivism. Okay, she was an atheist Jew, a Jewess, and
she's Russian too, right?
Yeah,
she Russian.
Yeah, and could not stand Catholicism. In fact, she wrote numerous things against Catholicism. That was one of the first things that, when I was debating Catholics, I would rely on Ayn Rand, and I think I got it at the end of her book, Virtue of Selfishness. You know, but so she takes a view called objectivism. It's a strain of thought within the umbrella term of libertarianism. She's a significant fountainhead, no pun intended.
That's her book title, Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. Those are her two big ones.
Yeah, which I've never been brave enough to read, but I've just heard it's almost a consensus that they're just super duper boring. You know, like, but I can imagine. I know some people that, you know, they really love it. I mean, tears, you know, coming down thinking about men pulling themselves up by bootstraps. But you know, but she's got this thing where you might even have judiciaries that are in competition. You would have maybe police that are in competition, currency within the same city that's in competition, because competition is king. Yeah. And so
it's evolutionary almost, right?
So so let me just break in. So Ayn Rand, so basically objectivism is summed up in Ayn Rand's statement where she says, I will never serve another man nor ask another man to serve me. And so it's just this, which kind of sounds okay. It's one sense. I don't know. It's like,
no.
So it's basically this
fan of self-checkout.
Radical individualism, and her thought that if the individual is basically selfish, like her idea was that selfishness is virtuous, because if everybody just takes care of themselves, everybody gets taken care of. That's the idea. But then that denies, like, the family is this fundamental unit, because like we were talking about, that the human person has the dignity, but he's also sort of, his being is communal, it's social. And so she's denying that. So that's one extreme. And Jeremiah, you were talking about that. And so that's one aspect of it, which that's an extreme that cannot be held by any Catholic. That's
but it's consistent. That position would be consistent with an unqualified demand that the lowest possible wrong that can, because then the question is can, and what satisfies whether or not a lower entity, right, your kind of intermediate groups and things like that it's actually accomplishing it.
So I would, and I agree. Like, you know, and it's funny, like, ideologically, I'm basically a monarchist. But then every time there's an election here in Canada or in Ontario, because things are so just whacked with, you know, for all the reasons you understand, I lean towards a practical libertarianism, because I'm just kind of like, well, I just want those wackos in Toronto and Ottawa to just kind of leave me alone, because they'll do, like, give me less stuff and you'll do less harm to me, and I'll figure out what I just want to do with my, you know what I mean? And I think a lot of Catholics are like that, especially traditional Catholics. Like, they understand that there's a proper understanding of the levels of government and monarchy, especially, or even a good sort of Catholic kind of republic, but they just want the people in Washington or Ottawa to just leave them alone, right? So there's sort of a practical nature to it. But when I understand subsidiarity, it actually is laid out pretty nicely in the New Catechism. It's paragraph 1885, and it says the principle of subsidiarity is opposed to all forms of collectivism. It sets limits on state intervention. It doesn't stop it. It sets limits, which is fair. And it aims at harmonizing the relationship between the individuals and their societies. It tends towards an establishment of true international order. So when I was reading that, I was thinking, because also when Pius XI talks about in Quadragesimo Anno, he talks about the higher levels should only interfere when they can essentially help, when they can essentially add something to the equation. And I do think there are times, like I was in university, I was debating with a friend of mine, and he told me he was a libertarian. I'm like, oh, what's that? And he says, there's only one rule: no harm. And I was like, okay, this sounds lame. And I basically said, I was like, and I was actually kind of a secularist, kind of liberal guy at the time. And I just said, dude, you're not going to have a police force? And he says, well, yeah, because they have to stop the harm. And I'm like, well,
right.
you're just, and I said, honestly, dude, like, I'm as small government as it gets, but I also don't want to spend all my time trying to find contractors to pave the roads. Like, I'm okay with having an association in my city that gets together to, takes care of that. And I don't mind if we put some money together so they can do that full time. So everyone's, like there's, logically speaking, subsidiarity would be absurd if you did everything yourself, because you could probably never do anything on your own anyway, right?
Yeah, and I want to talk about communism, and right here, just in terms of subsidiarity, because there's many other aspects to communism that need to be addressed, but we're talking about non-negotiables. If you're a Catholic, you can't be an objectivist. You can't think like Ayn Rand, the individuals, you should be selfish, basically. But also, you can't be a communist. You cannot be a communist and be a Catholic, period. And just in terms of subsidiarity alone, if we just consider that, the collectivist, and we've talked about collectivism. If you haven't heard that term, it's basically communism is what collectivism. Collectivism is basically I would think of it as a redistribution of all wealth. The government takes control of all the property and then redistributes to everybody. But the issue in subsidiarity, this is why in Russia they starved, in China they starved, and all these communist revolutions, they starved because even if they were all best intentioned, they were malicious, but even if they were all well intentioned, they couldn't, the large bureaucracy in Moscow could not, because of subsidiarity, were not able to serve the needs of all these individual peoples and communities because of subsidiarity. That you can't put everything in this large, huge bureaucracy and then serve the needs of a massive millions of people. And that's why people starved in these communist revolutions, because it's just logistically a nightmare. It just doesn't even work. I once asked I have a very learned friend, and I asked him, has communism ever worked ever? And he said, it could possibly work in a very, very small community. Yeah. If you're in a small village, there's like 100 people, everybody knows each other, and there's a common culture. And that's when you can have a lot more sharing, because it's subsidiarity. It's everybody's that's when that could possibly, it's just in the purely economic sense, not in any of the other senses of communism. But so just purely on the subsidiarity level, you can't even, you can't be a communist in this sense of communism, abolition of private property, because that's one of the principles of communism, which is completely anathema. That cannot be held by a Catholic. You cannot believe in the abolition of private property, because just on the sole logistical basis, it just cannot work. People starve, and that's what happened. Millions starved.
Yeah.
So
what say you, Jeremiah?
Go ahead.
Yeah. I used to be far more critical of fusionism. I used to be critical of, hypercritical, in fact, of the Acton Institute and the kind of Frank Meyer fusionism, American conservatism.
Define that.
Fusionism?
Yeah.
The idea of kind of the prevailing National Review styled, Acton Institute styled conservatism that on the one hand takes certain traditional positions on things like marriage, but also tries to fuse them with kind of right-wing economic positions.
Right.
Okay. And
liberalism in terms of economics.
Yes. Liberalism in terms of economics. And yet at the same time, ordinarily very strong about marriage, certain social norms. They're not relativistic, as in, hey, we're all kind of coexisty, going up to the big G in the sky kind of thing. And so I used to be very, very critical of that. You know, I was a real hardcore guy about saying, like, hey, there's a certain school of thought of Catholic social teaching, and this is it. And I'm not there anymore. I'm far more accepting of that balance now. And I'm also, I still retain some criticisms to say, like, for example, you were talking about how on the one hand, you can't, the state can't have total control over something. And you get rid of private property, and yet at the same time, it can't go down too far and just be like, well, what if that doesn't work? Okay, what if the bottom rung isn't sufficient either, and is not reaching sufficient levels for satisfaction in a political economy? Take, for example, something like, and I don't want to get entangled in this too deeply, but just using it as an example, Obamacare. And say Obamacare, on the one hand, was unsatisfactory to people who were single payer, who said, we believe that the government should have a monopoly, in fact, on this, not just a public option, but that this is the way our system works, is that you pay your taxes, we control the means of production. Okay. But Obamacare was not that. Obamacare, and so I knew a lot of people who, a lot of conservative Catholic types, that their immediate gut reaction was, man, this is socialism, or man, this is communism. And you sit there and you say, well, wait a second, like, if it doesn't gobble it up, we might not like that it's limited to a certain number of high profile, big business insurance groups. Okay. We might not like that. At this, maybe broaden it up, make it more available. But at the same time, it was trying to work together to try to provide a something that is needed, and also recognized as needed by popes, by social encyclicals that talk about healthcare, and that talk about in fact, connecting it to one's dignity. Okay. Accessibility to it. Right. And that it would not be so overwhelming that it's going to just be like, well, I either get my medical needs taken care of, or I'm broke. Right. One of the two.
I
go ahead,
Tim. Well, I live in Obamacare. So this is why I had subsidiarity as my first one, because there are certain technological changes that warrant different approaches to how you apply certain things, and that's why politics can so often be contextual to the time, and I get that. But I would just say, okay, I can tell you without a doubt that large-scale universalized healthcare is a nightmare. I'm not saying that there's not good secondary effects. There are. Like in Canada, we have very good doctors, and you go to a hospital, and when you get the care that you eventually get, it is usually very good care because they're very well trained, et cetera. Like, it's not that the doctors are bad. It's not even that the machines are like, the things that are working are running on time when they're working. But it becomes inherently, because it's in the hands of a non-Catholic state, it's inherently utilitarian. So when it's time to get a surgery, if it's not like here in Canada, right? If it's not life-threatening, you will wait a very, very long time, like 2 years, 3 years, which means you could be 67 years old with a really bad hip, and they're like, well, you got to use crutches for the next 18 months. And anyway, that's just, we don't want to go on that too much, but that's why I have subsidiarity as sort of the guiding force to how to apply these things on a practical level, because I do think it's a good thing. I mean, even if you believe in private insurance, which there's a place for, even that is still, in a sense, public insofar as a group of people decide where to put their money, and it's applied in an equitable fashion, sort of, right? I mean, Gavin McInnes, right?
Yeah.
And he talks about how he's a part of some Christian healthcare thing in New York, and he's like, I know I pay like more than I'll have to use, but he's like, I'm okay with that because I paid into this program. That makes sense, right? And but the catastrophic care is there if he needs it. So I believe that the popes are correct when they talk about the necessity of access to healthcare for human dignity. I believe that. But I do think that if this subsidiarity is missed at how it's applied, then it can become very dangerous, which we've seen in England, for example, with like the death panels and things like that.
Right. Yeah. That's very important.
Which we're not far away from here in Canada.
And this is so healthcare so we talked a little bit about, I mean, this is what we're showing right now is that there is, so we've got, on the one hand, we've got a principle, subsidiarity, which every Catholic must believe in, but then there's different applications and we're going to disagree on how to apply those exactly. And that's where we go back into the church in her faith and morals authoritatively gives us subsidiarity as a principle. And then the king, the government, the lay people, basically, we then have the authority to apply that. And the church, does not have the competency. Let me be careful how I word this, but the church does not have, because what we're dealing with is Pope Francis saying that we need to recycle and use less air conditioning and stuff like that. So the Pope or any bishop, they have authority to say whatever they like. I mean, they have authority over, Christ, like we said, Christ the King has authority over everything. But there is a certain expertise as well, because, a scientist or an engineer can give us judgments about the impact of air conditionings or whatever. And obviously Pope Francis is relying on those things when he makes judgments, or at least attempting to, or whatever. But there is a certain sense where what the church is saying about specific things is of a lesser authority because it's not directly tied to faith and morals with the same degree of causality, if you will. We can debate about an air conditioner. We can disagree about the effectiveness and whether or not that goes against a particular principle that is authoritatively set. So there is a sense where, because what I was going to get into was, and I want to get back to this though, because get into those essentials and non-essentials a little bit more. But before we talk more concrete, so we talked a few principles, we've talked a few concrete things. So objectivism and communism, which cannot be held by Catholics, and the concrete philosophies and their application. Do you guys have any other principles in the abstract before we go more concrete?
I had respect for the worker, respect work, and respect for the worker.
Yeah.
Okay.
I had that.
Let's talk about that. So what does that mean?
Well, I just, I'll use an example here from Ontario, actually. So it's an example of how I think that the idea of cooperatives, or the idea of a very distributist model, but in a kind of organic sense, works pretty decently. So here in Ontario, have you guys ever seen milk come in a bag, not in a jug? Do you guys have that? So this might sound so strange. Look up Ontario milk bags. Anyway, it's a unique thing. So a friend of mine from Chicago, he was here for a friend's wedding, and he's like, this milk in a bag thing, I'll never understand. Anyway, it's a whole thing. So anyway, lots of our friends are dairy farmers, and farmers in Ontario are as conservative as it gets. However, and usually very Christian as well. However, we have a system here called the Quota System. And it was actually implemented by the farmers, by themselves, not the government. So it was the proper levels were followed. And, these dairy farmers, their families came from Holland and Ireland about 80 to 100 years ago in most cases. And they started these farms at a time when it was much easier to do so financially. And then obviously things have changed with the mechanization, et cetera. And they basically saw all the other farming industries going, small farms, selling them off, and then becoming mega farms. And this legacy they had sort of built for their kids, they said, well, this is probably going to go away soon, right? So they actually made the decision to make the quota system where cows are attached to a specific value of quota, of the amount that they produce. So there's sort of a range in which they're allowed to produce so much. It's not that they're capped on how much money they can make, but they've got 80 cows. There's a certain amount that they produce out of that. And then if they want, they can get more cows and make more money that way, et cetera. And also part of the deal was that all milk in Ontario has to be, all milk products that are made in Ontario have to be they're from within 100 kilometers of where you bought it. So you have these random, like Parmalat, that big milk company. There's random like Parmalat factories in middle of nowhere, Ontario, because it's in these strategic locations, 100 kilometers from whatever. But one of the things that's been great about it is that the farmers were in charge. They decided as sort of an organic association how they wanted to do things, and it's kept them in business. And admittedly, the price is a little higher than it would be. Like we go across to Michigan and it's like $1 at Aldi or whatever for a gallon of milk. And here equivalent would be about $3.50 American for a gallon of milk. So it's 300% more. But it was, in my opinion, a good decision because it kept these smaller family farms open, and that's a thriving part of the economy. So that's kind of where I look at the Catholic approach to respect for the worker, from a sense where they had the agency to organize within themselves and then dictate to the government how they best saw their industry being thought out, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Could somebody compete with that?
With the milk?
Could you, for example, have started a farm and said, "Hey man, that's $3.75. What if I sold it for $3.25?" Like, you know what I mean?
Could,
like
yeah.
if you, yeah. Oh, the
store could. Yeah, like it's not you couldn't, but no, if you want to be a dairy farmer, yeah, you're in a system for sure.
So it's basically a guild.
Kind of. And it was there. No, not all farming is in that. Like I think it's dairy and chicken, because pigs are not in that. We have friends that are pig farmers, and that's but dairy and I think chickens are in that. Anyway, but that was what they decided for. And also too, what's interesting is, okay, when you start learning about farming, and Benedict XVI said that the rural communities had to become the heartbeat again of civilization. He said that a few years ago, I saw. But farming is not all equal. So that's once again where the proper levels of consulting come into it. The subsidiarity principle is that it would have been silly for the government to say farming is like this. And it's like, which farming are you talking about? So it was a good thing that there was enough respect for the specific types of farmers to make the decisions for their industry, right?
So how does that play into the dignity of work? Or what I hear you saying is that the worker controls the sort of his own industry.
Yeah.
So you're saying dignity of worker is basically that the worker is respected in his desire to control. Yeah, go ahead.
Because it probably plays into property rights a little bit, but when you start getting the mega farming thing, and I'm not saying that that's wrong. I understand there's different contexts for that, but you know, if you are a like middle class dairy farmer, that makes sense. You have a smallish family farm. You are able to have the dignity of ownership. You're able to have the dignity of sort of sovereignty over how you do your affairs. You can build a life that's fits the way you want to live with your family. You know, you can, like literally the farmers around here, they have their cows on a milking schedule that goes around the mast times, things like that. Whereas if you have like a mega farm, it's just kind of like we milk 24/7, and like you're a farm hand and your shift is 6 a.m. till 4 p.m. just because it is. Right? So it sort of takes away the ability to have that work home balance, I think, which I think is a big part of respecting, because the worker is a human being and he's got kids and he's got a family and he's got, you know, his kids get stomach flu in the middle of the night and he's like, well, I can't come in this early. And it's just silly, these demands sometimes we have on people. Whereas being more in control and having a say on how you're going to run your industry, I think mitigates a lot of that potential disrespect for the fullness of who the worker is as a person.
Yeah. I would say, because I have that on my list as well, you know, the idea of dignity of labor. I mean, that's one of the pillars of Catholic social teaching, you know, but I think, I'm trying to think, it was a quote, in fact, that was excellent. And I wish I had it right here, and I do not, and I don't know why. But anyway, talking about Pope Francis. Here's a quote, for example. Work should be the setting for this rich personal growth, where many aspects of life enter into play: creativity, planning for the future, developing our talents, living out our values, relating to others, giving glory to God. And then, yeah, it's a fantastic quote. And so, there are things to do with just the very nature of what work is. And it's like working out one's salvation in a way, that part of the curse, right? Part of the problem with the fall and what we did is that now we're sweating by our brow. Yeah. Right? We have to earn these things. We have to really work for real. And there's going to be thorns and things that hurt. And that includes the difficulty of going to work and dealing with other people. Yeah. Dealing with even with the boss, maybe, people you don't like, and saying, well, I gotta, the person coming in to buy something got ticked off because my product wasn't very good, and everything else. Those are things that you have to struggle for, and without doing it, you don't eat. Okay, so there's a demand to work in and of itself, and then you, insofar as you are connected to that work. Okay, insofar as you are a laborer, so you're laboring, you're working hard at what you're doing. To that degree, you are worth more than a unit of time.
Yes.
So you are not just a minute, or and so when people go, well, he's on the clock, he's worked for 1 hour. Yeah. Well, okay, so you're paying for the time. Or are you paying for my time? Me as in a person with dignity, made in the image of God, for a specific purpose. Yeah. And there has to be a balance with this. And I'm skeptical of things like, well, I at least understand the argument when people say, if I had to pay a living wage, then it's going to bankrupt me, right? Certain levels of people. I understand that. I also understand the idea that if we spend the money over here and that, maybe our specific enterprise, thus far anyway, has been for development of product, right? Like medicine and science and things like that. And we have to invest a certain amount of money into that in order to develop that, so that it can be beneficial to people in the future. And you take, what's his name? Who was the most hated guy? Scarelli. Martin Scarelli, or whatever his name was. That guy that pumped up the amount of money for an AIDS medicine. But his argument was, look, this is within the market. Not only is it within market value for this, but it's also the fact that I'm actually investing in more things. Right. I'm investing in future medicines, for example, like antibiotics. And people have failed to realize the necessity, in fact, of doing that. And that problems with bacteria and infection is going to cause a rampant amount of distress in the future, where people are going to be dying from that in a way. Right. Yeah, they're going to say, well, can't I just take that medicine? I have an infection in my mouth. Oh no, it's going to spread to your blood now, because we don't have any antibiotics for you. But my only point in bringing any of that up is simply that while I understand that there is a reasonable discussion to be had between the person who owns and the laborer, I think that discussion at least needs to happen, and that people should be recognized as more than a unit of time, as more than a throwaway. I like Pope Francis's idea with the throwaway culture, that we treat people like that. Mm-hmm. You guys talked about that with the dating culture in one of your last episodes where you guys were talking. That same concept a lot of times is at play with the employer-employee relationship, is the throwaway culture, right? That you're just, well, peace out, bye. You're a replaceable person, no big deal. And in a sense, there's some truth to that, but there's always got to be a balance of this, and you always have to try to understand the fullness of that person. And so,
right.
I think there's a balance. Yeah.
Yeah. So are there any, so that's dignity of worker. Are there any other non-negotiable principles?
We said property rights, right?
Yeah.
We
We didn't really go into that much, but I guess it's sort of self-explanatory, you know, and that's, I mean, that's, it kind of goes back into the family, because the family has the right to distribute their property to their children. Right. The parents have the right to obtain property, own the property, and have rights over that property so that they can use that property for the good of their children.
Yeah.
Right. And I would say, like, so when you understand, like, the word property, anyway, the roots of the word in Latin languages is, like, in French, it's, you know, propre, which means like pertaining to myself. Right. So I'd say, like, c'est la mienne propre. It's my thing, you know? And I would say that I think you could have, like, we need a more, like, when we think of property rights in North American politics, we tend to just think of, like, stuff that we own, which is a part of it, of course, and the land. And that's an important part. I mean, Adam was put in a garden, and that garden had boundaries to it. Like, that was his place. And that's a very, very important thing to remember. But it's about more than that. It's about what is proper to man, what is proper to him in his purview. So I think that we need to understand marriage under property rights, in the sense that I belong to my wife belongs to me. Like, we are almost, it's almost like she's my property. I know that sounds crazy to the feminists, but I'm also saying I'm her property in a sense as well. Okay. So relax, everybody. And, but then also our children. This is why, if you look at the communists, I read it somewhere and I lost it, but it was these Polish guys, and it was translated in English, but it was the 10 Commandments of Communism. And it was really interesting. And I didn't know this, but in the beginning, in the Soviet Union, they actually abolished marriage, like, at the very beginning, and they abolished parental rights, because they understood property all the way through. So the state owned everything, including the children, and you couldn't get married because they knew that because they were Orthodox before they became whatever, so they had a similar understanding of what marriage was, and they were vehemently against it, of course. So they understood that they had to abolish the fundamental property that every man has, which is his family, right? So kids were taken off to gymnasiums to be whatever, and they had public women, which were basically like publicly funded prostitutes and things, and no one could get married. It was nuts. They actually ended up realizing what a disaster they had done, that they ended up flipping the coin and having really stringent marriage laws because it was too destructive to their society. But anyway, so property rights, that also plays into like how we educate our kids, right? Because our kids are our property. They're proper to us. So how they're interacting with the outside world is a property issue, in a sense, because it's like our stuff going out there, you know, healthcare. Yeah, exactly. So property rights, it's obviously easy to understand in a sort of land or stuff sense, but it expands to all those things which are proper to you, if that makes sense. So I think that it's worth expanding on that.
I would expand on it a little more even, and say that there are some things that people believe are proper to them that are actually not just proper to them, but proper to everybody, and even those who are not yet born. Mm-hmm. And so, like, for example, the idea of creation, and to go back to this, I know it's been a theme of this papacy to talk about this, to say, you know, we have an obligation to those who are not yet born to ensure that the globe and the earth, which is a collective thing, right, and that we are stewards of it, right, that he gives to us, so that we can tend to it and care for it, not so that it can say, aha, it's done with me, but that it's something that is passed on transgenerationally as an inheritance, which presupposes the very idea that there will be people beyond us that this is for. And so I think it's a good thing, and to talk about even the poor and what belongs to the poor that may not, a lot of people might say, well, this poor person took, or these poor people want want certain things from us, the richer people, and the fathers of the church and the popes and council or plural have said that this is not yours in that sense. I like there's a Paul VI in Populorum Progressio says, as St. Ambrose put it, you're not making a gift of what is yours to the poor man, but you are giving him back what is his. You have been appropriating things that are meant to be for the common use of everyone. The earth belongs to everyone, not to the rich. End quote.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, that's
Drop
actually
the mic.
Drop the mic. Yeah. And so there's an element of that. So once again, though, to balance it out, to say there is a dynamic of this, that it is in fact the person's, rich or otherwise. If it's, my ball, we learned that real quickly, my ball, right? Or my toy. And so these things are in one sense ours, especially if we have done work, because then it's related to the dignity of work and our proper use of time. On the other hand, there are certain things that in solidarity with the world and to recognize the dignity of humankind in another person, especially among the poor, to realize that there are maybe things in our lives, especially in the West, especially in the Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic nations, the weird nations, as Jonathan Haidt would call them, right? That we have a lot of things that if we were really honest about it, we might kind of look around and go, how did I get this? Like, how did these things happen? And how should I act in the future? And so I would only extend what Kennedy said, which was all very well and good, and just simply go a little further with that in solidarity with the world.
Yeah. So, I mean, what we're noticing with this whole conversation is that these principles are all about balancing extremes. That's what a virtue is. A virtue is a mean between an excess of one thing and a defect on the other side. And I love what you're saying, because that reminds me of how St. Thomas says that in case of necessity, theft is not a sin. And that's so, like, after World War I, the Germans were being starved by the Allies and they were dying by the thousands. And one of the Catholic bishops in Germany said, it's not theft to break into these storehouses and steal the food, because you're starving, literally. These people are dying by the thousands. So, so there's that, and he talks about communicative justice between man and distributive justice, which is sort of the common good. So I wanted to go into what I was thinking about the four sins that cry to heaven for vengeance. And I wanted to touch on this as an example of, here's some concrete things that sort of illustrates these social ills that have massive impact on the whole common good, but it also illustrates the simple moral choices in the simple sense, like this is a black and white issue. And then on the other hand, there's also gray issues, even in these four. So the four sins that cry to heaven for vengeance are: one, willful murder. So that obviously that's black and white: willful murder, abortion, contraception, willful murder. It's very clear, black and white. Number two, the sin of Sodom, which is sodomy is, again, it's the complete perversion of what the family is. It's a complete destruction of that. And so another black and white issue, totally black and white. These are both intrinsic evils. But then 3 and 4 is when it gets to be complex. So on the one hand, you have the oppression of the poor. Number 3, oppression of the poor, which that gets into one issue that I was trying to think of, another social ill that's been condemned as much as this one, but usury. Usury has been condemned by the church. I can't think of a single social ill more condemned by more popes, more saints, more councils than usury.
Huge.
But it's not a black and white issue, because modern contracts are so complex and modern economics are so complex, because interest, all usury is interest, but not all interest is usury. And that's a subject for an entire other video. But then the number 4 of these sins crying to heaven for vengeance are defrauding the laborers of their wages. So the first 2 are just black and white issues that are always intrinsically evil. It's very clear. There's never any circumstance where this could ever be allowed. Whereas 3 and 4 are situations that have great gray area in terms of what exactly is oppressing the poor. If I buy a MacBook that is being made by sweatshop slaves in China, am I oppressing the poor by buying a MacBook or buying an iPhone? Or, you know, what exactly does that mean exactly in the modern context? It's a lot harder to pin that down. But it's still so. And what all I mean to say with these four things is Catholics are able to disagree about how 3 and 4 apply in a given situation, and they can't disagree about whether or not they're wrong. I mean, they are intrinsically wrong in their own sense. You know, oppressing the poor. If it is oppressing the poor, it is intrinsically wrong. There's never a situation where you could oppress the poor, but we're going to disagree about how exactly that's going to play out in the given context. Whereas the first two, so that goes into the modern American controversy among Catholics is that so many of the bishops are trying to push these other issues besides abortion as being equally issues. And the problem is, yes, immigration is an issue. Yes, the environment, it is an issue. Pollution is bad, but these are things with so many other factors that make them so gray that there are so many other factors that go into play with determining the morality of immigration, for example. Whereas abortion is entirely black and white. There's no, it's a very simple issue. And it is the most preeminent because it attacks the very fundamentals of our fundamental principle of dignity of man. So that trying to get at these simple things on the one hand, and then these sort of areas of disagreement. What do you say?
So 2 things. One, when I was doing my reading for this, and I've been thinking about this for a while, I think that the thing that we have to emphasize is a richness of poverty. Right? If you look at how is it that we can have a society in 2020? I mean, we have access to all these technological things, et cetera, et cetera. Clearly, those things aren't going away, right? I mean, it's not like everyone's going to say, "Hey, I'm never using electricity again," right? Maybe it'll happen, some prepper style disaster or something, but it's not going away anytime soon. So the solution, we could debate till the cows come home about what political measures to take, but from the person to person level, if you look at people that are truly holy, and not just in their piety but also in their externals, they usually have an obvious love of poverty, and it will be material in a sense. Even if they have money, the way that they live is simply, there's a stoicism to it. There's a almost like, I don't know, there's an organic sort of simplicity that they have in how they live their lives and how they purchase things, etc. And that's just a matter of virtue. So I think if we keep in mind that we have to have a true love of spiritual and material poverty, I think that solves a lot of these issues, at least on the smallest level with the people that we're around. And secondly, we confuse very often social justice, which is a legitimate thing, properly understood, and social charity, which is a different thing. So when someone thinks of social justice, for example, they think of a soup kitchen, right? This is the popular conception. Technically speaking, that's not really a matter of social justice. That's a matter of social charity, which is a good thing, and we ought to be charitable. But social justice is just a matter of justice applied socially. So really, it's just strictly a matter of justice that involves more than one person, right? So with the second two that we're talking about that are more gray, I don't have an answer to how we not oppress the worker in this indirect sense. We're buying computers from China and things like that. But I do know that if we in our lives practice a strong understanding of personal, spiritual, and material poverty, then we mitigate the need for a lot of these things in our lives, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have anything to add there?
Yeah. I would say that when it comes to for one, I want to say I really like that last part that Kennedy just said, that if we have a certain attitude toward being poor, right? A certain kind of love for it, and even preference for it, even for ourselves, and a disconnect, a detachment from belongings and what makes us, especially in the West, that we identify with what we own, and that we need those things for identity. And I think that Saint Jose Maria Escriva, I think he says a lot of things about that in the book, The Way, that I think people, especially men, should read that, The Way. But when it comes to the oppression of the poor, I guess I would only add this, just as a thought, that sometimes oppression, like you, Tim, you brought up the idea of if we buy an iPhone. I'm on one right now. I've got a MacBook right next to me right now.
Yeah.
And so I have examples of this. And let's say that we go, well, not only, are they doing terrible things with not paying very much money to the people in those areas, they're also doing pretty terrible things with, monitoring people, the privacy problems, and that especially affects the poor because they don't have any means whatsoever to really protect themselves, except for not having enough money to even get one in the first place, which might be, in fact, a grace. But I would like to say, though, that in some ways, and I'm only halfway joking by saying that, but the thing is when it comes to oppression, number one, is it just separated by time and space? Like if we say, well, am I part of it if it's happening over there?
Right.
And if I'm only receiving the benefits of it. I mean, like that's kind of what it is. And that's a hard thing because what does it mean for me? Can I still use the iPhone? Can I still use the MacBook? But not just what's happening right now, like with Apple, but to say, what if situations in the past, and I know this is a controversial one, but reparations, things like reparations. I mean, that's a serious conversation to have. And I don't think that it's entirely unrealistic in the way that says, well, we would need to get blood work of everybody, so on, so on.
And what is that for non-American viewers, Jeremiah? What are for non-Americans?
Yeah, well, they have them also in Canada. They had things that have gone on with the indigenous people there. But the idea, for example, that if we have in America, we're involved in a kind of slavery that was particularly interesting, kind of a very different way historically of dealing with the trade and dealing with how all of this worked out and the rules that we had for it, and that this really had an impact on specifically Black people, right? And I don't want to say that it was only Black people. I know the argument that there were some indentured servants. I know that, but I think we'd be kidding ourselves if we were to say, well, it's the same thing. Yeah, I don't think so. And so if we say the long-lasting impact on African Americans that were brought here, and in our society, and the residual effects of the kind of racism that would even make that something we would do in the first place, right? That doesn't just go away like that. And you say, well, there's been a lot of progress, and say there's also been a lot of problems, and not just for the people who were originally slaves, but over time. Do people now, ancestors of people who own slaves, or just simply people who are white, for example, and part of a system that was broken down largely, almost exclusively, into Black and white. It didn't assure that every white person was going to be rich, right? My great-grandparents on my dad's side were moonshine runners in the Appalachian Mountains, okay? They weren't banking a bunch of loot, but they were definitely white people, okay? And they had certain privileges and benefits that Black people did not. And the idea that just went like switch, boop, we had Martin Luther King Jr. and it's good now. That's fake news, phony baloney nonsense. And so the question is, do people and groups, do they have a responsibility individually, collectively? How does that play out? I don't have answers for that. But I believe that is a kind of oppression to deny that it has much of an effect at all, and deny that we have any role whatsoever, or that we should even question and have a serious sit down with people about this issue. And that's why I'm so willing to speak with people, African Americans, Native Americans, about these kind of topics, because I think that atonement is something that would be helpful to discuss with them.
So, thank you, Jeremiah. So, we've got what principles? We've got Christ is King, Mary is Queen, distinction without separation of church and state, the dignity of the person, the dignity of the worker, the irreducibility of the family, property rights, no communism, no objectivism. I don't know what else we covered, but any other non-negotiable principles or concrete morals in the political system that are applicable to all Christian or all Catholics in the world in any country that we're missing here?
I can't really think. I mean, I can't think of any that aren't at least subsets of what we've already talked about.
Subsets of, okay.
Yeah.
Except I would simply say, and maybe this has been touched on somewhere else, and it's not really a particular positive principle that says like, here's, do X, Y, or Z, but that there is no one model.
Yeah.
That there's a wide array of models, and that there's ways to mix it up. Like I don't know if it was one of the episodes you guys were on talking about, or one that I was on with you, where it was talking about kind of mixing it with a monarch, a strong executive, or a monarch, and having a senate or some kind of aristocratic kind of hierarchy in that way, and also having a more democratic dynamic to it with certain participation, localism, and those things coming together. And there's many different ways that can play out. It doesn't have to be the American system. Right.
So you know what's interesting about that is you guys know Charles Coulomb, right, with Off the Menu and
yeah,
he's an author. I will love him. He's hilarious. But one of the things I learned from him that was so interesting was that within the monarchical systems, there was actually a healthier diversity of how they were applied in the different countries. So because we think of monarchy and it's like we have this, I don't know, Disney version of a guy on a throne with like a scepter and that thing does things, right? But monarchy essentially means the hereditary nature of being in control of a people, right? And in some capacity. However that plays out is anyone's guess. It could be where the monarch is greatly involved in smaller affairs. He could be the monarch of, you think about kingdoms. I live in, Huron, Perth County. There's like 130,000 people in an hour and a half sort of radius around, right? And this is bigger than some kingdoms were, with kings and the king of Andorra or something like that in Spain. There's places that literally their kingdoms are smaller than the county is in rural Ontario. So even the idea of monarchy, it just was hereditary. It was hereditary governance, which actually I think kind of makes a lot of sense, because I always say to my students, I'll say, if you could go to a doctor, would you rather the guy who just like really liked medical school and went, and he might be really good, or would you rather a guy who was raised to be a doctor and was trained in that trade since he was a very small child on what he should do? It's possible by the laws of averages, but that the newbie could be as good, but it's very unlikely, right? And then you apply that to politics, and it's like, well, they don't even go to. If you get a degree in politics, you'll probably be a terrible politician. But
I can vouch for that.
Right.
I can vouch for it.
And then usually it's just a popularity contest anyway. That's a whole other topic. But you're right, Jeremiah, that there is a diversity on how the things can be applied. And ironically, I think that the diversity is more properly expressed within the traditional monarchies, which we look at history and we see how they functioned, right? Anyway, that's
another good principle, is that the church does accept the monarchy, the oligarchy, which is where you have an aristocratic body of elders running society, and then you have the republic, which is much more popular, sort of democratic. The church accepts all three of those. And in fact, St. Robert Bellarmine discusses how the church has all three of those aspects too,
right.
because
right.
the Pope is the monarch, and the bishops are the oligarchs. But then also all the bishops and priests can come from any layer of society. So that's sort of the democratic element of it too. So he says that the church itself system sort of has all three. So what that means to say is that no Catholic, what that means is since the church accepts all three, no Catholic can exclude the others and say that only Catholics must be this or that. So, I mean, you could argue that this is the best system, but you can't say that
no anathemas.
Every Catholic has to be this or that a proponent of that system. And also, like you were saying, I think another aspect of that is that different systems work better for different peoples. Like in America, we would never accept a monarchy because we're just so virulently democratic and revolutionary minded, whereas in other systems, monarchy may work better with a much more homogenous culture and that type of thing. So that's a very good point. And the point I wanted to sort of end on was the preeminent issue of abortion and being the preeminent issue, the most important because there's, I was thinking about trying to work in divorce into the four sins that cry for, because I mean, there's a lot of, sodomy isn't a terrible evil, but we have to understand that marriage was actually destroyed by heterosexuals first before it was destroyed by homosexuals. I mean, the divorce rates just exploded everywhere in the 70s. And so that's another aspect of this.
Ronald Reagan.
So in 1973 was Roe versus Wade. It was also the first year in America where more marriages ended in divorce than death. But abortion, it's even worse. It's the worst social evil because it cuts at the very foundation. I guess let me ask you both this question. Why is abortion the most important issue? And I've heard Father Frank Pavone of Priest for Life. He said that the reason it's the most important issue is because if you don't have the right to life, you don't have any rights at all. Nothing else matters. You're dead.
Yeah.
Well, so go ahead.
And you can't defend yourself. Like I heard, who was it? I don't know if it was Dale Alquist or who it was, talking about Catholic social teaching. Yeah, me too. And they were, if I'm remembering correctly, somebody brought up in the crowd, there's kind of this idea of making racism and that kind of bigotry on par with abortion. And you could hear people say, yeah. And I thought, I can imagine those both being tremendously heinous sins against people. But the guy that you're being a racist against or a bigot against can seriously, he can whop you in the face, okay? There are things he can do that he has recourse to or she has recourse to. Even the ones that are like, look, you ain't coming across the border. Let's say they come face to face with that beautiful wall that Trump's been putting up. Let's say that they do that and they don't have a ladder, the 30-foot ladder that Pelosi promised they'd have. And so they're not able to get over it. That person on the one hand is very, very upset because they're not able to go, and they can say, and let's say that it was put there, let's say it was a racist thing. That person still has behind them a bunch of people.
Yeah.
There's hope there too. It's not as if the only hope in the universe is on the other side. That's why there's also that preference for the poor and what Kennedy was talking about the poor. But the child inside the womb, on the other hand, there's nothing that once the poison and once those cutters and everything get through that wall, okay, and penetrates into that Garden of Eden, what should be, they are completely beholden to whatever wicked scheme is being done on the outside. That is dramatically different than anything going on the outside. Maybe other than euthanasia, where they're not able to defend themselves either. But they've lived. They've lived. Okay, they're at the place now where we're talking about how does one die. With this one, we're talking about whether or not they're even given a chance to breathe and to see their first. So, big difference.
No, you're right. And one of the biggest, it's obvious why abortion is bad. These are obvious things. But one of the things that it's such a sneaky evil, because it's pretty hard to convince somebody with eyes to see that they should hate another person. I mean, you can, but it's like they can see for themselves with racism, slavery, all these kinds of things. I mean, there's an agency involved where the person's going to go, I hate that person because I've decided their skin tone is wrong or whatever. But then it's something that you can see. But generations, and I mean, listen, guys, before I was a Catholic, I was just an average secular kid. I would have said something like, whatever, it's a woman's right, or just, I would have said the average kind of stuff you hear on college campuses. And you grow up kind of in the system, and if you don't have parents that tell you about this stuff, you will just sort of believe the hype, and you'll never even consider the reality that it's a human person, et cetera, in the truest sense of the word. And that's what's so sneaky about it, is that it's like a hidden, clandestine perversion of the value of a human person, which it not only takes away the actual physical life, but it contributes to like the deadening of the intellect, because I mean, if we can't, Fulton Sheen had a wonderful talk on abortion, and he gets all excited the way he gets at certain points in his talks and all dramatic, and he says, elephants beget elephants, lilies beget lilies. It's simple. Human beings beget human beings, it's just, and it's true. It is a fundamentally simple thing, but when it's shrouded in all this, rhetoric and this so-called science and whatever, and rights and politics and stuff, it's such a sneaky, pernicious, like most people that were alive during slavery, if they didn't live in a state that had, or if they didn't live near slaves, they probably never would have come into contact with a black person in many states for a period of time. Same here in Canada. I mean, when people got to Canada, I think the estimates are between 100,000 to 300,000 First Nations people, sort of. And Canada's huge. It's like bigger than America. Even now, 95% of the country's empty. We got 45 million people. So you could have gone your whole life, years, hundreds and thousands of kilometers without seeing a person who was not European, because they're just, so those types of things, understandable. But the way that abortion is put to us, it really is like the devil's magnum opus of how he's duped people into believing this thing. Anyway, yeah.
I was going to say, when talking about this, I like the idea that you bring up about how sneaky it is, right? And the kind of way that it affects society. And I mentioned Ronald Reagan in reference to the no-fault divorce laws in the United States. Interestingly enough, and I think that there could be a book written similar to what I'm going to mention here about him and his role in it. But he wrote a book. In fact, he's, as far as I know, it says right here, the only book to be published by a U.S. president while he held office. And it's called Abortion and the Conscience of a Nation. It was published in 1983. And it kind of talks about that, about the psychological impact, the subtle and terrible ways that this affects a nation, even psychologically, and how we behave, and how it being so secret makes it worse. And, I think it might be interesting if someone wrote a book called Divorce and the Conscience of a Nation, and you can still have his picture on it, right? And say this is actually a little bit about you, Mr. Ray. And I don't want to go against the Gipper too much. Actually like him. And so I don't want to go against him too much, but he was involved in that. But I think that that's a great point that you bring up about how so many of these things, and that can go back and be my final thought on that, I guess, is everything we talked about, whether it's subsidiarity, the subtle ways that the government takes things that ought not, right? Or that lower groups, because of power and because of money, make it so that maybe the government doesn't get involved where it ought to. And that sometimes these are complex and difficult. Or solidarity, the subtle ways that a lack of solidarity affect how we behave. The subtle ways that our failure to think about the generations that will come after us may affect the way that we consume things and the throwaway culture that we have, and the mentality that we have of that, of a throwaway culture, whether it affects not just the goods, but the way that we treat people in their time, or the way that we treat women and men when we're talking about being with them and dating and stuff. And so, so much of this is subtle. And I think that is why it requires the faithful Catholic, the faithful son and daughter of the church, to be keenly aware of what the principles of Catholic social teaching, and why they should very calmly and in a way that looks past the partisan, the 3D glasses of red and blue, right? That can be really disorienting at times. To look past that, take off those glasses for a second, and look with the spectacles of the church and with faith, and to see those principles and how they can apply in our lives. And I think if we do that, people can start, of course, by watching this video again. It's a good video.
Yeah. So I love what you guys are saying. I mean, I remember when I was younger, I didn't understand why abortion was so evil and why it was the most heinous evil. And it was somebody put it to me like this, that, because I was against abortion, but I was also working on, helping the poor and things of that nature. But somebody just sort of pointed out that there is no one more poor than an unborn child, like you're saying, Jeremiah, like oppressing the poor. There's even a poor man can defend himself, but an unborn child, there's no one more vulnerable, more in need of society's protection, no one more poor than an unborn child. I think if you just people who don't understand the preeminence of this issue, just have them look at just have them see, okay, here's racism. You can see that happening. You can see the pollution or the immigration, then just watch an abortion and just compare it. And then just do what your reason demands that you do. And your reason demands that this is a heinous evil crying to heaven for vengeance. And these unbaptized children must be protected. They must be given birth and given baptism. It's a terrible evil. So this show, we were trying to get into all these essential principles, and we're going to have further future shows. We're going to get way more into the weeds of what's actually happened. We're talking about Trump, talk about Democrats and Republicans and whatever, and all the actual things that are happening on the ground in all these political situations.
I'll talk about the Bloc Québécois as well, just to bring the Canadian element to it.
Oh, good. Thank you. And we're going to we'll talk about voting, because we're basically always choosing the lesser of evils, and how do we determine those things, and we'll discuss how do we justify this or that. So let's pray. Let's pray always for all of our leaders, whether or not they're Christian, Catholic, or communist, heretic, atheist, or otherwise. We always want to pray for our leaders, because that's what the scripture tells us to do. Praying for our leaders. They do have the place of God, and they do have God's authority to rule, and they should do it according to God's law. So we always pray that they may be converted and create just laws according to the true King, Christ the King. Viva Cristo Rey. Let's pray. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Ghost. Amen. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Give us this day our daily bread.
And forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Amen.
In the name of the Father, Son, the Holy Ghost.
Amen.
Into